All right, welcome back. Let's begin the lecture for the second half of the chapter. Now, the biggest hurdle to implementing a piece rate system is the difficulty of determining individual output during team production. Some economists have tried to develop a theory about why firms exist in the first place. One of those theories is that in team production, which is what has to happen for most products to be produced, one individual can't do it on their own. You end up with people needing to work together in a team. Very quickly, you end up needing management to coordinate the members of those teams. Now, it can be very difficult to determine exactly what each worker is contributing. When I write with a co-author, who should get the most credit for what we do? Should it be me? Should it be them? This can be really difficult, especially when individuals are doing completely different roles. Worst yet is the free rider problem. So this is a tendency for when groups of people work together, someone ends up slacking off, doing little of the work themselves, but benefiting from the work that everyone else does around them. So it took me 10 minutes to find this, but I added a TikTok video that I recently saw somewhere that shows the free rider problem in action, where this guy is just kind of running around pretending to work, but you actually follow him, he doesn't accomplish anything. Under a piece rate system, when there's team production, so when there's a lot of people involved in the team that are actually producing these goods, this guy can still get paid as well as the other workers because it's difficult to tell what he's actually doing, what he's actually producing for the team. The problem is that everyone has an incentive like this to share because they have to put in all of their effort, but only receive a portion of their benefit that's shared by them all. So why should I bust my ass while the other guys slack off? And soon everyone begins slacking off. So for a piece rate payment system to work, everyone has to be responsible for their own output, and it has to be easy to monitor for who's doing what, who's producing what. In some organization, workers aren't paid based on how much they produce, but rather on how their performance compares to others. This is similar to a tournament where the winner is rewarded based on their relative performance rather than the absolute results. So think about sports tournaments. The top prize goes to the best performer, even if everyone else also played well. In the workplace, tournament-based payment structures reward the highest performing employees with bonuses or promotions. The idea is being that competition pushes everyone to work harder because they're all aiming to win that top prize. But just like in sports tournaments, only a few people can win in this situation. Then this structure can affect worker motivation and their behavior. This way, firms don't have to use some sort of objective benchmark, and they can deal with fluctuations and all the different background things that affect all the workers equally. So they don't have to worry about punishing or rewarding them for something that's outside of their control. They can reward the best performers and encourage workers to try to outcompete each other. So your textbook gives an example of professional golf, where the payouts for a tournament are based on the place that each golfer finishes in comparison to the other, not their absolute score. Whether the winner has 3 under par, 3 over par, or 30 under par, they're going to get the same payment from that tournament, the same amount of prize money. It's all about winning. While it can be difficult to determine just how much an individual worker produces on a clear, objective number figure, it can be much easier to determine all of the other workers' relative standings to each other. When workers are competing in a tournament-like pay system, the size of the reward or the prize spread, the spread between one reward and the next smaller reward, or between the winners and losers, that plays a big role on how much effort they're going to be willing to put into their work. So a larger prize spread means that the difference between the top performer and the runner-up is significant. So workers are motivated to work harder to win that big prize. However, there is a downside. If the prize spread is too large, workers might be tempted to focus less on doing their best and more on stopping others from winning. This can lead to behaviors like sabotage, where workers might intentionally undermine their coworkers in an attempt to get ahead and to beat them. Additionally, when the competition feels too tough or the stakes are too high, some workers might become discouraged and quit, thinking that they have no chance of winning. So it can be harmful in some situations. But that said, tournaments are used to elicit effort when it's difficult to determine a worker's actual productivity and can do a good job of eliciting that effort. So let's use an example with 2 workers to see how it can function. In this case, the firm announces that it will award 2 prizes, the higher one and the lower one, based on how they rank these 2 workers. The workers both know that to win the tournament, they have to put in more effort, which for them is a negative. Again, more effort can be difficult to do. So the marginal cost curve here represents the displeasure from supplying more effort. Maybe it's physical fatigue, maybe it's mental strain, maybe back pain, maybe just, a brain fog by the end of the day. If the spread between the first and the second place prize are too large, or I guess if it's large enough, then the marginal revenue, which is the increase in the prize money, is also large. So we can see the difference between the two on this graph. So the marginal revenue low shows what happens when the gap between the prizes is small. The marginal revenue high shows what happens when the top prize is much larger than the second prize. The worker is going to, they're going to supply effort until marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So if it's low, the marginal revenue is low, it's going to be this point X, where the marginal revenue crosses the marginal cost curve. The marginal revenue is high, it's going to be a pure point Y, where the marginal revenue crosses the marginal cost curve. So when the potential gains of winning or the marginal costs, or the marginal revenue from the prize is much higher, workers are willing to supply more effort. So here we have the effort down on the bottom. If the reward, the marginal revenue is low, they're going to be here point X, which corresponds to this level of effort. If the marginal revenue is higher, point Y up here, they're going to end up supplying even more effort, a higher level of effort because of the greater gains from winning. So now that we understand the basics of a tournament pay system, let's look at a real-world application, CEO compensation. In many companies, the pay structure for executives, particularly CEOs, often resemble a tournament rather than a direct reward for their output. So CEOs are not necessarily compensated based on how much value they individually produce, but rather in comparison to others who are vying for that top spot. Now, why is this important? Because it helps explain why CEO pay can be so high, much higher than might seem reasonable based on their individual performance. Just like in a tournament, companies offer large pay packages to attract top executive talent and to motivate their senior executives to push for that so-called top prize, for that role as the CEO and the giant salary that comes with it. As we discussed, when the prize spread between the winner, so the CEO, and the rest of the employees is too large, it can create unintended consequences like excessive risk-taking, undercutting or undermining coworkers, or discouraging those who feel they can't win the competition. But when we look at CEO pay through the lens of the tournament theory, we can see why the compensation is structured that way. Now, there's only a weak correlation between CEO pay and firm performance in the real world. So if they were being paid for their objective performance, so more in line with the piece rate wages, we'd expect the correlation to be stronger. So this provides some evidence that what we see is that CEOs are being paid in more of a tournament payment system. So the CEO acts as an agent for the owners of the firm who are represented by the board. While they can oversee the firm's actions, they don't really have the expertise to know if the CEO is doing a good job or not, which makes the piece rate system more difficult to use as a payment scheme for CEOs. So then we can begin to think of this as like a tournament for the vice president level, where the best performer over time at the vice president level is rewarded as the CEO. They receive that massive salary increase because they're the tournament winner. Oh, my apologies. Now let's look at another example, the incentive pay for teachers. In order to try to prove educational outcomes, one solution that has been tried to use in several different places across the country has been to pay teachers for successfully teaching their students and improving their outcomes. Again, just like CEOs, probably more than CEOs, it's no easy task to determine what part of the success of the students is due to the teacher's effort and their skill versus other unrelated things. Unsurprisingly, the evidence for when incentive pay for teachers has been tried is mixed at best. You can read more about the problems of the specific examples of teacher performance pay in the textbook. But the most important takeaway, what I want you to remember, is that it's not always the best solution to use tournament pay or incentive pay for different professions. For some of them, it's simply too difficult to determine how much effort a worker supplies or to measure the output that they produce. In these cases, performance pay can cause more issues than simple time rate pay, and that's why we often rely on time rate pay. Now, worker shirking can be costly for firms in many different industries. It's tempting to take little breaks or to slow down during the day. Even people who enjoy their job have these sorts of temptations. And for those who don't like or don't care about their jobs, the temptations can be even stronger. So your textbook gives a few examples that up to 80% of losses in shipping are due to employee theft, and 30% of retail workers steal from their employers. This can be rampant across many different industries. So one thing the firms try to do is to design compensation packages that prevent this kind of theft from occurring. So one thing that firms can do is rely on an upward sloping age earnings profile to disincentivize shirking and theft. This sounds complicated, but what it really means is paying people more over time as they spend more time on the job. Basically, the idea is that if you offer more money when workers maintain their employment longer at the firm, they will try even harder to avoid being fired and not take the risks of shirking or engaging in theft on the job. So it's often the case that the worker's career value of their marginal product is horizontal over time. However, when it can be difficult to monitor the worker's effort or to monitor their honesty, they know that the chance of getting caught is remote, and they're going to end up cutting some corners. That's human nature. That's something that we all do. But the firm can prevent this by offering wages that grow over time. So what happens is early career workers receive less than the value of their marginal product. And then over time, their wages rise so that by later in their career, it's considerably higher than the value of their marginal product. So they start out, instead of this horizontal line being paid the same amount throughout their career, they start down here at point A. Over time, slowly increasing up towards the value of their marginal product. Then eventually, in this case at point T, or time T, their salary goes above the value of their marginal product. So now they are above, all the way up to point C. Now the goal of the way you design this and the slope of their wage curve over their career is that you want this part, the later career value that they're being paid above the value of their marginal product, to equal the area of this triangle. So what they sacrifice early on in their career is being made up for exactly with the amount they're being paid over and above the value of their marginal product later in their career. And because the workers know that this later career raise is going to be coming, they're further incentivized not to shirk in the short term. So if the worker is caught shirking before they reach point B, so somewhere down in here, they really lose out. They're sacrificing the short term in order to receive more later in their career. But they still have to be employed later in their career to make the sacrifice worth it. If they get fired down here, they sacrificed for the first several years of their career, and they never made up for it later in their career. Also, something in the textbook mentions that's interesting is that firms only want workers to work until N years on the job. At this point, at N years on the job, they reach point C, which is where the sacrifice early on for the workers in their career is made up for by the firms later in their career. At that point, both parties are square. The worker has been paid their lifetime value of their marginal product. If the worker keeps working for the firm beyond here and stays up here above point C, they receive the higher wage rate than they did earlier in their career. They're being paid above the value of their marginal product, which actually costs the firm money. So as a result, a lot of firms that structure payments in this way try to get employees to retire around point N. Another concept is efficiency wages. Now, this is the practice of paying workers a higher wage than the simple market equilibrium wage. The idea is that by offering these wages, employers can increase firm productivity and motivation, they can reduce turnover of their staff, and attract higher quality candidates. This approach contrasts with the traditional view that wages should be based solely on the market supply and demand. However, I want to point out that I don't see this as ignoring supply and demand. Rather, I think it includes all the ancillary costs of employment that often get ignored when we look at that simple market supply and demand model. Think about it from the HR perspective. It can be costly to conduct a job search. And then once you hire that new worker, costly to train that new worker and give them time to get up to speed, eventually building up that tacit knowledge. It takes years and years on the job to build. So, of course, paying above the simple market equilibrium wage that doesn't account for these costs can make sense for a lot of firms. Higher wages can lead to increased worker productivity as employees feel more valued and motivated to perform well. Some research says that this tends to fade over time, that initially workers appreciate the higher wages, but then get used to it and that kind of fades. However, by offering efficiency wages, firms can still decrease employee turnover. Maybe they're not going above and beyond because of how happy they are to receive the higher wage, but they're still less likely to leave the firm because of that higher wage. That can still benefit firms. Higher pay also makes jobs more attractive, leading to more stable workforce, fewer leaving, and it'll attract higher skilled workers, more high quality workers, enhancing the company's overall performance. A competitive wage can serve as a signal of a desirable workplace to workers that are outside of the firm that are considering switching. And higher wages can deter employees from shirking or from underperforming once they're on the job, because the cost of losing a well-paying job is greater than the cost of putting in the required effort. So this is a way to help align employee interests with those of the firm and get them to work as hard as possible, or harder than they would under what you would expect under a simple time rate payment system. So let's briefly look at an example of how this would work for a firm. For any given level of employment, the relationship between the firm's total output and the wage paid to workers is given by the total product curve. This sloping curve here is the total product curve. Note that the curve slopes upwards. This is because as the worker's effort and productivity depends on the wage that they receive. The more that they're paid, the more effort that they supply and the more work that they produce. The wage here in the x-axis. The more you're paying them in general, the more output they're going to produce. When wages go up, workers may be more motivated or may attract more skilled workers, leading to higher output. But the firm can't keep raising wages and increasing output forever. Eventually, the firm encounters diminishing returns, and the total product curve that was steep begins to fade. So at a certain point, it increases very sharply as you pay them more. But eventually, that's going to run out, the diminishing marginal returns, and you have to pay workers a lot more to just squeeze a little bit more output out of them. The slope of the total product curve gives us the marginal product of a wage increase for the existing workers. So to simplify the statement, the total product curve shows how a firm's output changes based on the wages that it pays its workers. So the blue arrows here represent the average product of the wage paid to workers. It's basically the slope of this curve is the change in the y-axis over the change in the x-axis. So the change in the effort divided by the change in wages. The point X here represents the efficiency wage. The textbook goes through a bunch of equations to derive this. That's less important. What I want you to take away from this is that this point right here, point X, is a point where the total product curve is tangent to the average product of the wage paid to workers. So what do we see? Compare that to point Y. What ends up happening? Well, the worker is being paid the higher wage. Instead of W bar, it's WE for the efficiency wage. But the level of output here, Q bar for this point Y, is much higher for the Q for the quality or quantity for the efficiency wage. Ends up being much higher. So the firm, yes, has to pay more in wages, but they also receive much higher effort from workers, and likely because they're attracting more higher quality workers because of the higher wages. So for the firm, even though you may think that, oh, paying higher wages is bad for the firm, reduces their profitability, it can be worth it in many cases to pay the additional wages above what we see in the simple labor market equilibrium wage because of all the positives associated. Okay, so let's end the chapter here with this slide. So a high wage makes it costly for workers to shirk. So if you pay them above what we consider the simple labor market equilibrium wage, it can cause them to work harder. Or if you change the payment structure, it can cause them to work harder to supply more effort as well. People who are well paid might work harder, even if there's no threat of dismissal. So we were talking before about the time rate jobs, that workers in those positions are doing just the bare minimum to not get fired. But if there's no threat of firing, but we change how payment is structured, then you can get workers working above that minimum level of effort. Efficiency wages, paying them above what we see in the simple labor market equilibrium, can help retain workers so they're not leaving and increase the output and profits because you're attracting higher quality workers. Workers aren't leaving as often, so they're willing to stay there and they're building their skills and they're happier because they're earning this higher wage. So it can benefit the firm in the long run. So to wrap up this chapter, while the simple equilibrium showed us how wages are determined by the labor market and the interaction of supply and demand, sometimes it does make sense to pay workers above the level determined in that simple model. If designed properly, it can be used to increase worker effort, encouraging them to produce more or staying longer with the firm. It can help them build up experience and tacit knowledge, ultimately becoming more productive and increasing profitability for the firm. So while it's something that's good for workers, it's also good for the firm. So understanding how these alternate payment structures affects employee effort and productivity is important for an HR professional to know when it is appropriate to design these different sorts of payment structures or when it is appropriate to keep with a simple traditional time-based payment system. So with that, that brings us to the end of chapter 11 and with the end of this module.